Good morning and welcome. My name is Stephen Ma, and I have the privilege of being the Chief Purpose Officer here at Nomos. You've joined us in our third of a series of webinars on the future of work, humans, purpose, where it's all going, how to react, hoping to give everyone throughout our major ecosystems that are working with us some pro tips about how to reconceptualize what work means for them, how to work better in teams, and how to help their organizations learn. This week, we've got a bit of a doozy. It's one of my favorite ones. The topic of our webinar is learning in organizations. We're going to talk about the basic unit of learning, which is the team. We're going to talk about how organizations can learn and give you some techniques to invest in your teams, teaching them how to learn, and some techniques to invest in yourself should you be thrust into the role of a facilitator and or to give facilitation tips to people who are helping your organization learn, have the right kind of events, whether it's over Zoom or when all of this is over, of course, when we go back to face-to-face. So again, my name is Stephen Ma. My life's purpose, my professional purpose is to make work itself more human. And I've had the privilege of doing that with governmental organizations, some big four banks, some of the world's most prominent non-profits, as well as management consultancies. And I've worked in a bunch of startups, health tech, gaming, etc. So not every sector is represented here, but I have worked in a wide variety of fields. So I'd love to speak to you about your specific context. Even if you just want to shoot the breeze and talk to me about science fiction or practice Italian together, I'd love to hang out and do that as well. Okay, let's hop to it. The basic unit of organizational learning, we might think is the individual. This one person, they do something different as a result of making some change. But by and large, throughout Nomos's journeys, throughout all the organizations that we spoke about earlier, we've found it's more effective, increasingly effective, if we focus on a slightly larger unit, that of the team. So before I talk about what does that mean for teams, what would you do with teams, it might behoove us to define that a little bit better. When we say teams, we mean groups of people that don't happen to be, there are teams that are individuals that happen to be working alongside each other, whether that's physically alongside each other or org chart alongside each other. I don't mean people thrust together in those sort of inadvertent, uncoordinated groups. When we say team, we mean groups of, say, 3 through to about 9 people for which they have a shared goal and they're working on something together. Whether that be a project context, hey, we need to, build this piece of software or get this new item of clothing out to our retail stores, all the way through to, say, operational context, where we might be manning a call center and these 3 to 9 people are all focused on a particular region or a particular set of customers. So when we say team, we mean this group of 3 to 9 people, preferably with a shared goal, where they're working on these things together. Some of their skills are moderately fungible, as in one person could probably do or support another person in doing their role. And it applies in any industry, but particularly contexts that are perhaps project-oriented or business as usual, operationally oriented. When we think about people in these groups, we gain a lot of advantages. We gain the capability of course, not treating people like individual units of skill. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later when I talk about this concept of cross-skilling. But indeed, we gain the capability of thinking of them as units of culture that we can invest in over time. So what you can see on this slide here is an example of how a team, based on the research by Dr. Bruce Tuckman, that talks about how teams grow, form, become more intimate with each other, and reach this stage, this ideal stage that we call performing, that overarchingly helps organizations embed better learning and drive better outcomes, because they're not so focused on a man or a woman or a person being an island of their own, but they're leveraging the power of a group. There's a lot of caveats to making that work successfully for us. And Tuckman talks about some of the stages as a spectrum that teams can move through, and some of the things that they need to do in order to cash in. They need to make change to themselves and their team in order to move to the next stage. It's a little bit like a computer game where you got to fight the end boss before you go to the next level. So let's examine Tuckman's stages and what it means for teams, and as they learn, number one, about each other in order to grow and become a more performant team, so they can learn more things about their product, their services, their customer over longer periods of time. So Tuckman says in stage one, you kind of got teams, they form together. People might think of themselves as individuals. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but they might be very individually focused in terms of the value add they might have to their team and to their organization. There's a lot of self-focus there. What that leads to, especially if we're talking about context where teams got shared work or project scenarios or even operational scenarios, that it might be that the team is unaligned. That said, if it's a new team or it's maybe a reformed team, people might be on their very best behavior. And a lot of their conversations are about do this task, do that sort of thing, rather than focused on anything a bit larger than that. They don't really care what anybody else is doing. They're happy and off in their own little world. Of course, with changes like we've all experienced in this post and existing COVID world, we probably all experienced that. What happens when we lost our physical workplace and we got thrust into our work from home scenario? Suddenly we're all back to being independent again. We have this exercise that we need to do with the people that we want to work with to reform into some kind of team. Typically what happens if teams are able to move to the next stage, and it's not a given that teams will move to the next stage, they need to do certain activities. Tuckman contends that the major activities that they do here is risking of failure. Saying things to other team members like, hey, here is the task list and here are things that other people in my team were expected to do on my behalf. And I've discovered that that person is highly productive. If they say they're going to do something, they're totally going to do it maybe on the time they said that they would or maybe earlier. That person, while maybe a bit unreliable, they might volunteer for things and not actually go and deliver it. So what happens is each individual person, as they say something, hey, I volunteer for this task, or hey, I'm going to do that, they start interacting with their team, you create a social dynamic. And that social dynamic starts creating lots of invisible things, things like people's opinions of each other, social jockeying, sometimes very visible things, personality clashes. So Nomos is a technology house primarily. We do a lot of technology delivery, but we've also worked in, say, non-technology contexts. And when we talk to technologists about these kind of concepts, we use this concept of tech debt. In technology, tech debt works like financial debt. It's a decision that you make at the time, hey, I want to buy this couch, or hey, I want to build my software quickly in this way. And you deliberately do it because you know that you want that couch and it'll be useful to you right now, or you need that piece of software and it'll be useful to your customers, 3 days from now. But you might have made a decision to incur, borrow money from the bank or put on your credit card in order to do that, or, not necessarily polish our technology in this way, but just get it out the door. That, is kind of undone work. It's something that you owe. When we do coaching, we also talk about the human version of tech debt. When teams start forming opinions of each other, when they start working on social jockeying, when they start trying to become more intimate together, they actually start agreeing. They go, oh, I think John is like that. I think Jane is like that. This is how they relate to each other. That stuff is debt. We've made assumptions about each other. We've started on a certain design of our team. And again, debt, whether you talk about technology debt or debt, whether you're talking about borrowing to have that couch, they're not bad things in and of themselves. You need it because it helps you do things with it, have that couch, form your team, ship that piece of software. But you've got to recognize that it's undone things and that inherently they're invisible. So later on, I'm going to talk to you about some techniques about how to make those things visible, particularly the relationships between teams, the assumptions that they might have with each other. And then we can apply that both internally to the team and their dynamic, and externally to the product, to the customer, to help the organization learn. So as a team storms and forms, they might, assuming that they apply some of the techniques that we talk about, resolve their team's relationships. Oh, hey, I really don't like when we have this much work. Oh, hey, John, it turns out that he's actually got this much capacity or that much capacity because he didn't really tell anybody that he was working part-time. But now that we know that, actually, we realize that let's optimize the amount of work that we give these team members as a result of discovering something potentially that was invisible to our team before. We might also discover more pedestrian things like, this person just didn't have that piece of equipment, or they just didn't have access to that system that we expected them to be able to do. Having lots of conversations that will enable us to resolve our team relationships, particularly in healthy ways, and I'll talk a lot about the unhealthy ways a little bit later, will help us move our team forward in ways in which we can affirm each other and grow stronger together. So assuming you get to the third stage here, you get to teams that Tuckman calls norm teams. Norm teams, they feel more intimate. They know each other quite well. Everyone's kind of resolved the sort of weird conflicts or assumptions they had about each other. It feels like things are vibrant and it feels like things are working. There's a spirit of cooperation and people accept each other sort of for who they are, and they agree, you can agree that there are common goals. So if you're thinking, and again, we've all been in these kind of teams where it's like, oh gosh, like, there are certainly a percentage of teams that can't all agree on common goals, or you constantly have the personality clashes. It's very evidential, anecdotally at least, the validity of this Bruce Tuckman model, where we're talking about not every team is going to move to every stage. You need to do the orange arrow there, the thing in the orange arrow, in order to move your team from one stage to another. Many teams, even when they're at a successful level, they get to a level that's comfortable. Norming is a very comfortable level because people feel valued. You're actually meeting a fairly high level of people's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where they feel like they start belonging. But of course, at Nomos, we're not always satisfied with just good enough. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, the enemy of being great is actually being good enough. And so toward that end, if you really want performant teams, teams that are really kicking goals on behalf of their organization, we're talking about cashing in the team's cohesion, doing things like, hey guys, we all like each other, we all trust each other, we can all do this stuff. Let's try to do something, I don't know, radical, like, the radical means different things in different contexts in different organizations. But it could be something like, let's automate some of our existing work so that we don't have to manually do it. Let's just spend a week doing that. So to our boss, it doesn't necessarily look like we're doing any work, but in subsequent weeks and months, it'll lead to some amazing productivity. I say that's cashing in the team's cohesion because obviously you need to convince everybody in the team to do something like that. And I also say it's about making sure that you've got intimacy between the team so that you can trust each other. It's like, oh, well, we can all go to the boss and say, hey, boss, this is a really great idea. So you can be a part of that organizational change and enable that organization learning. But again, if you've done that and you've won that within your team and with your boss, you might still fail. We're talking about that being a risky, cash-inable position because you might try to automate something, it might not work. And then at the end of the week, you're like, actually, we learned a bunch in trying to automate it. We couldn't actually get the success we wanted to. Is that okay within the context of our overarching organization? So there's certainly a second level there, which is the topic of a different conversation we have when we talk about organizational change, about great performing teams that might be at norming level, trying to coach and encourage their organization, a much larger unit of social cohesion, to be performant, to enable them to make it safe to fail so that they can take on a lot of that risk and they can move to this performing goal. But when you can get there, suddenly your supervisors or your team leads are like, wow, you guys automated that thing. Like, suddenly the work that we were normally doing is now already done by a script or a machine, or we've got some smarter way about how to optimize it. And if I'm giving you the impression that this is a technology only thing, I'll send you some videos after the webinar. That's not true. You can totally do it in white collar context, in retail context, in disaster response scenario context. And we'll talk through a case. I'll send you a video on a case study. And if you're interested, we've got some other webinars on how you might go about doing that in a non-software context as well. But that's success, that risk that the team puts themselves under. Hey, we're going to try this new mini improvement to help improve us. If it turns out well, you can win a lot of organizational support for continue to change in that way. And you can start to bring the conversation in where you can make managers, supervisors, adjacent teams part of your team, helping the organization grow, learn, and continuously improve. So yeah, that's the Tuckman model. It's one of the 3 topics that we have today around investing in our teams, looking at pro tips for facilitation and organizational learning. This is the basic unit, the team, 3 to 9 people, and some stages to recognize how a team gets more mature and what they need to do to move along this maturity curve to become an ever more performant team. Let me move on, and I'll only touch it lightly because I mentioned it a little earlier, around this idea of cross-functional teams. We have seen greater effectiveness in organizations in being able to deliver outcomes if their teams are what we call cross-functional. Most human resources teams, and I say most because there are some advanced organizations that don't think of it like this, will tend to think of their staff and their people in what we call an I-shaped scenario. This is a junior software developer, intermediate software developer, a senior software developer. This is a junior designer, intermediate designer, a senior designer. This is a apprentice lecturer, a senior lecturer. Either way, we are valuing, hiring, and assessing that person for a single skill. And the degree to which they do that skill is the length of what we would call their I shape. If we connect this idea with the previous idea, we can see kind of the power, or at least around what traditional project management considers something as a good thing about teams. If we've got 3 to 9 people, we stack 3 to 9 eyes together with 3 to 9 different skills, and then together as a team, this team can tackle these different things. That's kind of true and also kind of untrue at the same time. Because if we are thinking about people wholly as one skill, if you stack 2 or 3 different skills together, then you might be able to push a pipeline of work. But if I'm just making it up, but say you have a software scenario where you've got a designer, a engineer, and a tester, 3 different groups of skills. Person A accepts work that is design-based work. Person B accepts work that is execution-based work. And person C accepts work that's quality control-based work. If the demands on this 3-person team change significantly such that tomorrow, all the work that we have for the next week or 2 is design work, by thinking about our people wholly as eyes, we've actually made it such that the first person is going to be overwhelmed with work because they're the expert in the design area. The second and the third person is going to be like, well, what do I do? How can I contribute to the team? You end up with actually what is moderately dysfunctional scenarios where you may have to invent work that's not necessarily the most valuable work to your end customer or to your organization as a whole in order just to keep the pipeline of person 2 and person 3 filled. As you can see, that's probably not the most effective way to think when you're talking about organizing people into teams that have shared goals rather than individuals that have individual queues. I make no value judgment on whether individual queues or individual persons acting in a grouping that you might colloquially call teams being a good or a bad thing. We are biased towards coaching organizations in teams because we do think that leads to greater performance. We've seen evidence that leads to greater performance. So what are we saying then when we talk about cross-functional teams? We're talking about leaving behind this idea that people only have one skill. We're saying embracing the fact that most people are actually multi-skilled, that designers can be better designers, particularly when they're encouraged to think about the things that they're designing for, including how to engineer said thing. When designers are thinking about how it gets tested or quality control at the end, especially if they have to do a component of the quality control and testing, then that will again make them better designers. If you're the quality control person on the end, being able to do and execute components of the design and or the execution aspect also make you a better quality control person because you understand the craftspersonship involved in those kind of activities. Of course, I recognize and we recognize that no one person can ever be the best at multiple skills, especially if you've got a complex team with a wide varying skill set. But certainly this investment where each individual person, they might have an eye that they're selling. Hey, I'm a senior designer at this thing, that goes ahead and invests in themselves to learn a little bit more about the execution component, a little bit more about the test component. They start growing what we call a T-shape, a little bit of skill in lots of different areas that are quite diverse. If everybody in the team starts doing that, your team becomes what we call more fungible. They're able to reduce dependencies on each other because most people can do most things, even though there still is individual optimization between who's better and who's worse at it. And overall, the team is less brittle. They can actually work on things together in order to deliver it because it's the most important thing for a customer and for a product. In some organizations, this is a relatively simple thing, particularly if the skill depth is not particularly deep. In other organizations, this is the work of at least weeks, if not months, maybe years of investing in teams over long periods of time. But again, the payoff becomes people who become possibly what we call pie-shaped. They're multi-skilled. They can both design and deliver the work that they're doing, which makes them doubly important in their resume and doubly important throughout the organization. They can both engage with stakeholders and assure quality control. They've suddenly gained some new skills that A, is a good area of professional development and team belongingness for an individual person, and B, it's good for the team because they can respond to work very well, and good for the organization because the team itself becomes more performant and more able to respond to different kinds of work. Okay, a third thing that you can do, and again, I won't dwell on this, but deepening some of the thinking that we've got is we've talked about teams and how they become performant over periods of time, what you might need to do to cash in on that performance. B, we've talked about individuals and how to consider a breadth of skills rather than individual skill depth, more investing in each other so an individual person can do things across the shape of their work, called T-shaping. A third idea that I might leave to you is if you'd like something even more prescriptive about how do I invest in teams for longer periods, how do I create a framework or a mechanism to help them become more performant, some of the most powerful optimizations we've helped many organizations across the world enact is things like Scrum. It's not the only technique that you can use, but it's an example of the kind of agile thinking or agile implementations that teams can adopt to help themselves become more performant. And I'll actually borrow some of the ideas here. In particular, I'll borrow this top idea, this retrospective idea. Whether you're in an agile framework or an agile organization or not, you can use this top idea, this idea of retrospective, which is the Scrum idea of investing in your team such that they have an opportunity to learn about themselves, continuously improve themselves, so that each sprint, they call it, each week or each month, the team is doing something that might make them move along this Tuckman curve and become a more effective team. If you're interested in that, please do ask me when it comes to the question time. We've got a lot of free materials that we're giving away on our website. You'll get an email after this that you can go and learn yourself. And again, if you'd like to have a specific conversation about what does that mean for you, I'd love to chat to you about it. I'd love to talk to you and your teams about, if you wanted to adopt something like this, what it might look like. Okay. So that was our conversation about building better teams. Pro tip number 1, think about the Tuckman curve. Pro tip number 2, move people from I-shape to T-shapes. Pro tip number 3, consider something like Scrum. We're going to move now, as a segue from Scrum, to thinking about organizational learning. I want you to think about the first thing that we said near the start of this conversation, where we talked about the human version of tech debt, people having these invisible things about each other that hinder teams from becoming otherwise more performant together. Here's a different thinker. Here's a different model for how teams might be effective. This comes from a gentleman by the name of Patrick Lencioni, and he presents in his book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, 5 stories about a mythical, typical white-collar office team and about how they work together, or rather, how they don't work together. In this book, he lays out 5 different scenarios, and they range from invulnerability, people not even wanting to trust each other or trust others in a group. Certainly, that's an example of the human version of tech debt. As teams move from forming to storming to norming, it's certainly possible that you can end up in a norm where you might have a team that's unsafe. You can't say how you really feel. People are curious, like, how come John doesn't do that? Or how come Jane is like that? But Jane and John never feel safe enough to tell any other team member why it's like that. And things just are allowed to fester in an unperformant and actually highly dysfunctional way. That it feeds into and is a part of artificial harmony. When teams fear conflict, on the surface, sometimes we'll go and start coaching a team or start working with an organization. And on the surface, the team feels like they're great friends. There's a big laugh at the meetings, and everyone is like, oh yeah, I really like that guy. They're all friends with each other. But maybe work doesn't get done. Or it might be, as one of our clients likes to call, a hippo situation, where it's the highest paid person's opinion dominates the conversation and dominates the thinking in the room. Nobody wants to conflict or say anything that's kind of awkward. There isn't a contest of ideas. Other dysfunctions include a lack of commitment on the team because, the hippo, for example, the highest paid person in the room might say, this is what we're going to do. And everyone goes, oh, okay, I guess that's the boss. Let's not challenge that. and we just let it go. But then the way that people challenge that is maybe they undercut it or they don't authentically do what they need to, again, in this 3 to 9 person team, to actually deliver the work towards set goal or set agreement. So it feels like you're having the same arguments over and over again, or it feels like you set a goal, but no one really works that hard towards that goal. That then leads to the fourth dysfunction, low standards, right? Then questions get asked, like, how come we didn't do this? Why as a team can't we achieve that? Didn't we already commit to this thing? People avoid calling each other out. There starts to become counterproductive behavior, and it becomes this real snowball of really negative dysfunctions that we, given that every organization has moved to some kind of distributed work now, are facing as a possibility if we haven't normed our teams. Last but not least, very, very typical in teams that never really move past the forming stage, status and ego. People care way more about protecting themselves or their perception of how they are within the team and their organization. They spend a lot of mental energy on doing that instead of actually doing any work. Therefore, the work itself suffers. And as you can see, having any one of these dysfunctions is kind of a very toxic thing to be introducing into your team. The book is a wonderful template for telling you scenarios that you might be experiencing in your team. And then Shioni's got some pro tips for you at each level about what you, the team, can do and you, possibly the manager, can do to help coach your team towards better behaviors toward this. So I'm going to give you a pro tip of something that you can do. If you're saying, oh, Steve, that's great. Now I've got some tools at least to identify the stages of maturity of my team, how to coach my individual people. I'm considering this Scrum thing. Maybe tell me what I can do. I'm experiencing artificial harmony right now, just for example. How do I solve it as a team? Well, I told you earlier that I was going to borrow from some of our other materials. In Scrum, one of the most powerful events, they're called, it's think of it as a meeting, or better yet, as a workshop, is called the retrospective. And it's one of many loops to make invisible things visible. Some of those other loops include what the customer's needs are and doing things to satisfy that, what the organization's learnings are to do a loop to satisfy that. This particular loop is a loop about a team's investment in itself and to make themselves better than they were yesterday. There is another loop, which is important to talk about contextually around the work itself. So what I mean is, if you're delivering a piece of software or designing a fashion item to go onto a retail store at Zara or shipping boxes out to a disaster zone, there is a learning loop where we talk about how well did we make the item of clothing? How well did we make the piece of software? How well did we ship that box out to the people in need? That conversation is a separate one, and that's not the crux of what I'm talking about. The crux of what I'm talking about is for the people that packed the box together and organized for the box to be packed, for the people that built the piece of software, designed it, tested it, and shipped it to the customer, for the people that designed the clothes, shipped it to the retail store, and then eventually sold it at the retail store. How are they cooperating together, and how can they get better? How can we inspect the invisible human tech debt, status and ego, low standards, ambiguity, artificial harmony, invulnerability, and do something to improve? So here is the big thing that we want to give you in terms of value in this conversation. This book by Esther Derby and Diane Larson lays out a structure for how you might run this workshop. They recommend that this workshop be done at least in Scrum every sprint. If you're not running something like Scrum, then I would certainly recommend you doing it most frequently, once a week, least frequently, something like once a month. If you've got things like long-term traditional projects, like, I don't know, you're trying to publish a book over 18 months, or you're trying to rebuild a course that you're doing, which is a 6-month task, I would encourage you to get together as a team, all the people that are contributing to it, say weekly, at worst monthly, to talk about, okay, like, we'll talk a little bit about how the book is going, but let's have a separate conversation, a retrospective conversation, to talk about who we are, how we're working together, and how we can communicate better, work together. It's the process, it's the meta, if you will, of how we go about delivering the work. So Derby and Larson do us a service by giving us this workshop in 5 stages: setting the stage, gathering the data, generating insight, deciding action, and closing the event. It's a very useful format because most people, when they come to a conversation like this, are very prone to leap to say, oh, it's because John is lazy. if it's a particularly like unsafe team, or they might lead to the action. All we need to do is do this thing and it will just solve our team's problem. Or they might say nothing at all. It might be such an unsafe team that you're like, hey guys, let's have a conversation about how to improve. And then it's, everyone gets on the Zoom and it's complete crickets. This structure gives you a way to tackle some of those dysfunctions and help you move along to make your data visible and then resolve it into an action. So let me talk about one first, setting the stage. The facilitator's role is very important here. You pick someone, preferably the person, hopefully not necessarily the most senior most person, but definitely the person with the highest EQ, highest emotional quotient. They understand how other people are feeling. Maybe they've got a little bit of experience at facilitation to help you structure with this. If you've got no one in your team like that, you want a little bit of help, that's kind of our bread and butter. So if you want somebody to, give you a 1 hour session to help your team improve or coach you along, we'd be happy to do that. Just let me know at the end of this session. We can certainly help your team along that. We'd set the stage. We say, hey guys, we're all getting together to review how we've been shipping software over the course of the last month. We know and recognize that maybe it hasn't been going so well, but we want to have a positive conversation about how we might work better together. We're not going to delve too much into the scope itself, but we're certainly going to talk about our communication pathways, the way that we work together, what we think of each other, how we make decisions together, those kind of conversations. And then you can ask people the way that I'm role modeling for you now, do I have everyone's assent to be in a constructive conversation where we can seek to improve together? And then, you get people's assent. You move then to stage 2. This really helps you counter things like hippos, highest paid person in the room, or different personality types where you might have extroverted people or introverted people. We often use tools, such as a tool called Fun Retro. We'll send you a link to that, to help people note down their thoughts. How did the last month go? Was it effective? What was not effective about it? What would you suggest that we do in ways to improve? You might give people 3 or 4 minutes of just some silent writing time to process their thoughts and visualize it on a tool. If we were face-to-face, we'd use sort of post-it notes up on a wall, but you can use a tool like Fun Retro, which essentially is post-it notes on a digital wall to ascertain how people are feeling. You want to steer people away from saying, this is the action that we must do, but encourage them to ask themselves, why 7 times? Why aren't we a performant team? Why do we keep arguing about these things? Why can't we make decisions together? Why do I feel unsafe? Why did we set this goal and not be able to meet it? And then really have a great conversation about that. After the data gathering time, you move to 3, which is having the great conversation. Again, the facilitator's role is very key here. You want to do things exactly as I'm saying. Oh, that's a very interesting observation, John. Why is this happening? Anything to share, Jill? You want to encourage lots of people to share, hopefully to take some of these things, some of these invisible things, especially the artificial harmony things, and bring them to the forefront. And then, of course, and only then, after we've generated some insight, a lot of things might come out around the invisible human tech debt side, where people discover, oh, actually, I didn't know that was your context, or you thought that about me, or that was what was expected on the team. I'm really glad that we had this conversation. Can we agree that we're going to do this thing together differently? So together, the team might decide one action. And of course, when you're new to this, most people think, oh man, it's going to be it's going to be really hard, perhaps very cathartic conversation. Teams that are unskilled at doing retrospectives often end up with 50 things or 99 problems that they seek to solve. My coach to you is definitely write down those 99 problems, but commit as a team, as a facilitator, drive your team to just commit to one. The biggest one, the hardest one, the scariest one, the most painful one, but hopefully the one big change that will change your team. Make it very visible in your team. Talk about it every day if you need to, until it gets solved by the next time you meet, whether that's next week or next month. If you're new to this, I strongly recommend you pick the shorter cadence, as in the weekly meeting, and pick smaller things so that you can help the team learn how to continuously improve. After they get good at that, there's a bit of a self-reinforcing cycle of, let's talk about the awkward thing, let's solve it within the week, let's talk about the next awkward thing, let's solve it within the week. You actually get a lot of healing inside your team, no matter where they are on that Tuckman curve or what dysfunctions exist, because this is a neutral mechanism to enable you to look at some data, have some great conversations, and commit to one thing that you can improve on every week or every month, hopefully way before it goes wrong or happens badly again. I just came out of a conversation with one of my teams on exactly this topic. And so hiding names and identities, etc. We're working on a customer where the customer was always saying of us, where we do really good work to our shared end customer, the end user that we're looking to support, but we look like we're constantly last minuting things, or we're photo finishing was the word that was used. Why does Nomos so poorly manage its work so that it's only the last second before the deliverable comes out to meet and satisfy our shared user? And we talked about that. We talked about, it's about us communicating better. We've been doing retros every month for this particular team for some time. And our focus has been communicating better, communicating better, communicating better. Just today, things came to a head, and we're just doing another retro now. It came to light that our customer who shares workload to be done with us in service to their customer actually hasn't been the greatest at making sure that their component of the work is done. And it was only recently revealed after three times of doing these retros that actually Nomos is catching a lot of the work that we're expecting somebody else to be doing within that organization. They're not doing it. And we've just been really good citizens to continuously take on more scope, which is why it constantly looks like we're last minuting it. But I didn't even know that. And indeed, maybe one or two team members thought that they were being really good citizens doing extra work on behalf of everybody else. Nobody was thanking them for it. And that was a very, very hard and tumultuous conversation to have, because it's like, that's why you constantly finish work. And then somebody else could be like, yeah, it's because you don't finish your work. I'm doing it for you. You can see how that might go negatively. Running something like a retro where you transparently talk about the data in your team, you then have a good discussion, and together as a team, you resolve to not blame anybody, but commit to one action that you can do better, is certainly a healing mechanism that you can use in your team to fix what might be, possibly unhealthy team dynamics in team relationships. So I want to answer this last question. We've talked about pro tips and we talked about how teams learn. How do organizations learn? Well, it's not too different to thinking about how teams learn. Essentially, if you can take this and scale it up at team level, 3 to 9 people learning things, committing to one thing they're going to do different every time, you've actually already built a mechanism for how your overall organization might learn. A group of teams working together can collect the data about where each team is looking to optimize something. And if there's some congruence there, every team is talking about roles and responsibilities in this particular division not being clear. Every team in that division is talking about not having the right equipment. Every team in this kind of field is talking about not having conflict resolution skills. Feeding that to the right level of HR, structural management, or executive management is great organizational insight data to help them buy the right equipment, provide the right conflict resolution training, resolve the technology conundrums to enable teams to be more effective and more performant. Okay, so I've got some further tips for you about how you run that. As you become a facilitator, it's very important to think about formally opening and closing. I won't dwell too much on these, but you'll get all of these slides afterwards. So these tips are for people who have thought, Steve, that's a really great idea. I love doing this retrospective. How do I get started? I'd love to chat to you about how you might do that. But some of my tips to you is give a very formal opening, a very formal closing to the interaction. Design it, really sit there and think about, I know that this is the dynamic going on in my team. Ask questions in ways that help me structure how I think about that. Indeed, if you think it's going to be a difficult conversation, just like the one I gave you as a scenario, you might actually want to take some of your teams out a little bit early, some of your team members out a little bit earlier and one-on-one with them to set the scene or understand where they're coming from before you bring everybody together. And of course, anything that you say that you're going to do, you have to really drive that action that comes out of the retrospective to make sure the team does it, because what's the point of meeting together and saying we're going to improve something and have it lead to an action if it doesn't actually get action in the organization? You find that this last point might be the most important one, because a series of small, humble actions that you've actually taken to improve the team, building over time, is going to be much better than trying to commit to fixing even 4 problems and kind of half doing each of them. Okay, there's certainly lots and lots and lots of reading if you're interested in this stuff now that you can go down the rabbit hole and learn about. I mentioned Fun Retro as a tool there. You see it second from the bottom. There's a lot more techniques that you can use from the Agile Retrospectives book. It's fourth from the top there. And there's some other techniques that you can use to bring your teams and your tribes together, because retros aren't the only one. As written into a book by a wonderful Australian, actually, M. Campbell Priddy, who was a former GM at Westpac, and is now running her own agile consultancy, or she read the book Tribal Unity, talk about how teams can build culture over long periods of time by doing these kinds of activities. So I recommend you take a look at these things. Okay, thank you for your time and attention. We've been just at 53-minute mark now. I am always looking to improve. I'm always looking to run better webinars. If you'd like to take out your phone or go on your browser, nomos.co/feedback. If you take a picture of this, it'll QR code you to a quick survey, help you rate what you've learned out of this webinar, 1 to 10. Give us a bit of some feedback about how to improve. I'd really love to hear from you, because I myself and my team will look at this, look to deliver you something of high value in every subsequent webinar, which we're doing on Eventbrite once every 3 weeks. Thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity to present to you. My name is Stephen. I come from an organization called Nomos. We do a bunch of different things, from technology through to agility, as well as helping people make world-topping products. If you want to reach out and talk to us about any of the work that we do, we'd love to engage. Thanks, guys, for your time. You're going to get all of the answers to some of the questions that was asked, as well as this pack afterwards. I'll see you next time. In 3 weeks' time, you can find us on Eventbrite. Take care, guys. See you soon.